"Shut your mouth! People like you have no right to speak here," the officer roared, his hand roughly seizing the bespectacled woman's collar and dragging her across the center of the courtroom. He smirked, believing that the badge on his chest and the complicit nod from the judge on the high bench were his golden tickets to get away with any act of violence. But before his triumphant grin could fade, a lightning-fast punch caught him square in the jaw, sending him crashing onto the wooden floor. The woman straightened her clothes, standing tall with the cold aura of a seasoned former military police officer. She was Senator Helena Cole, undercover to expose the corrupt face of this institution. Amidst the chaos and blaring sirens, a single video recording changed everything, turning a rigged trial into a lever that toppled an entire empire of corruption and the chilling secrets of Cell Block 6 at the Eastbrook Courthouse. When the enforcers of the law are the ones trampling it, will a single punch be enough to awaken justice? Or is it merely the opening shot of a more brutal war they aren't ready to face? If those being treated this way were your parents, would you stay silent or stand up? Comment below, and watch this video to the end to see why justice cannot wait another second. In her office, overlooking the busy streets of Brooklyn, Helena Cole set her pen down to sign a short-term leave request. It was just a thin sheet of paper, the signature neat and restrained, yet it marked a turn that no aide or reporter could have anticipated. Morning sunlight spilled across the wooden desk, making the freshly signed ink glint faintly, as if reminding her that from this moment on, everything would have to retreat into the shadows. Helena placed the pen aside, drew a deep breath, and felt as though a fine layer of political dust clinging to her shoulders had just been brushed away. She knew well that as long as she held her position as a state legislator, any appearance anywhere would inevitably attract cameras and questions. Eastbrook required a different pair of eyes, quiet ones, unmarked by the imprint of power. On the desk lay stacks of envelopes from constituents, all already opened. Helena pulled her chair closer and turned over each letter, every line a pain for which no one had stepped forward to take responsibility. One woman wrote about her son, 17 years old, detained overnight and dead by the following morning. A roof repairman recounted being searched and held simply because his English pronunciation was halting. An immigrant from Jamaica reported being driven out of the courthouse by police as if he were a vagrant. And there were many more letters, voices all carrying the same helplessness upon stepping into the Eastbrook courthouse. Helena read each word with a tightening gaze, then placed a hand against her chest, feeling as though her heart were touching their very fear. The power she held in the legislature had never weighed on her as heavily as it did in this moment. Her phone vibrated. A call from Lena, her closest aide, the one who knew Helena's plan in full. Lena's voice was low and taut, as if afraid someone might be listening. She said, "You go in as an ordinary citizen. Don't show any attitude. Don't let anyone see that you've ever been on television." Helena leaned back in her chair and confirmed, her voice soft but steady. Lena sighed, perhaps still unaccustomed to the idea of Helena personally returning to a role she had left behind many years ago. But Helena knew clearly that without seeing it herself, every report was meaningless. Eastbrook was not like other places. It held shadows that official documents could never reflect, and she needed to see them with her own eyes. Helena rose and walked to the mirror in the corner of the room. The woman staring back did not resemble the Helena Cole the press had once described. Her hair was neatly tied back, a loose strand falling softly to conceal part of her temple. Thick-rimmed glasses altered her face by a subtle degree. The black suit bore no logo or elaborate stitching, allowing her to blend into a crowd without needing to lower her gaze to avoid lenses. Helena adjusted her collar, sensing another Helena being constructed. An ordinary woman going to court to seek justice for a loved one or to witness a hearing. An identity faint enough to slip into a place where a legislator's presence had always drawn attention. She opened the drawer beneath the desk, where her legislative badge lay. The small piece of metal reflected a cold light. Helena touched it lightly, then closed the drawer again. Today, she would go without that badge. A legislator possessed a certain authority, but an ordinary citizen carried a truer perspective. Eastbrook only revealed its real face when no powerful figure stood watching. Helena locked the drawer. She slipped on a light coat and glanced toward an old photograph on the bookshelf. A military police unit from years past stood in formation, the smiles of those who believed in justice glowing in the sunlight. But in the photograph was also someone she would never forget. A fellow officer was buried alive after a dirty arrest, recorded in the files as an occupational accident. Helena stood still for a long while, recalling the face of the friend who had left forever, then turned away, knowing that if she lingered, she would never find the courage to confront shadows like those in Eastbrook. On the street, Helena merged into the morning flow of commuters. No one noticed her. No one knew that the woman passing the corner coffee shop had once forced many officials to retreat during tense hearings. The feeling of concealment was both strange and familiar, like her days in the military moving under cover. Cold wind lashed her face, carrying car horns and voices calling out along the sidewalk. Helena quickened her pace, as if to hold back the thoughts pressing in. She needed calm. Today was not the role of a legislator. Today was an ordinary citizen, determined to look directly at the truth. At the station, Helena descended the iron stairs, her footsteps echoing softly in rhythm with the train approaching. She chose a less crowded car, sat down, and opened a special file on the Eastbrook courthouse. Figures appeared. 23% of cases involving allegations of abuse of power had been dismissed. Summarized notes from Lena described hallway cameras that frequently reported malfunctions, security staff repeatedly cited in complaints, and even a map of basement holding cells that no one wanted to mention. Helena read slowly, each detail like a stone placed in her palm, cold and heavy. The train came to a gentle stop. Helena's phone lit up. An encrypted message from Lena appeared clearly. A source has access to the hallway. Be careful. That place is waiting for you. Helena stared at the words for a few seconds, then turned off the screen and stood. Eastbrook was only one stop away now. The woman stepping off the train was not the legislator Cole everyone knew, but the only person willing to walk into the shadows, lying in wait ahead. The Eastbrook courthouse rose before Helena like a dense slab of concrete, hard and brooding. Cracks ran along the walls, blotched with damp stains, making the place look like a structure no one wanted to touch. On the sidewalk, a long line of people waited to pass through the security gate. Morning sunlight filtered narrowly between two buildings, casting the crowd below into deeper gloom. Most of them wore work uniforms, some in frayed clothes, night shift coats, still carrying the smell of chemicals. A few clutched crumpled paper folders, their expressions caught between wariness and exhaustion. Helena glanced across the line and recognized the familiar images from the letters she had read, now vivid and breathing right before her eyes. 3 fellow legislators accompanying her were already spaced out within the line. They did not stand together but kept natural distances, like strangers who had come to court for their own separate reasons. Carl Jenkins, the tall black legislator, was disguised as a taxi driver, worn down after a night shift. His hair was unkempt, his old jacket loosely tied. His face strained to hold the anxious look of someone counting every dollar to feed his children. A few meters to Helena's left stood Rosa Alvarez, a legislator of Latin descent, dressed in clothes dusted with construction grime. Her face looked hollow, as if she had just come off an exhausting shift. The last one, Vikram Patel, of South Asian origin, played the role of an immigrant with limited English. He clutched a folder tightly, his eyes darting constantly, as if afraid of making a procedural mistake. All of them stayed firmly in character, their gazes fixed on the ground, though Helena could tell they were watching Halford from the corners of their eyes. The tension could not be eased by words, only by the synchronized silence of those ready to witness Eastbrook's ugliness. Helena merged into the line, giving Carl a slight nod to signal her position. Her hand tightened around the stack of papers in her bag, not out of fear of a search, but from the weight of the mission settling onto her shoulders. She kept her breathing steady, her eyes lowered slightly. Everything had to look entirely natural, like an ordinary woman there to observe a hearing involving someone she knew. No unnecessary words, no movement that might draw attention. The metallic clack of Officer Bryce Halford's boots rang out in rhythm as he moved down the line from the front. His broad frame and the way he looked at people sideways reminded Helena of someone accustomed to operating within crude zones of power. He scanned each face like a warden inspecting inmates before roll call. The bearded man in front of Helena clasped his hands and retreated half a step as Halford approached. A Haitian woman hugged her paper bag to her chest like a fragile shield. Helena clearly saw fear ripple through the line each time Halford stopped. And from Carl's position on the opposite side, he was discreetly recording. Halford stopped in front of Helena. He slammed his hand down on the metal table, the sound snapping coldly through the air, and asked, "What are you here for?" Demanding rights. The question was not about security, but carried the tone of someone accustomed to sorting people by class. Helena set her bag on the table, keeping her gaze lowered, careful not to meet his eyes. Halford opened the bag and rummaged through it roughly, the rustling loud enough to echo across the area. A stack of papers was yanked out too forcefully and spun a few times before hitting the floor. As Helena bent down to pick it up, she heard him say, "Pick it up fast. I don't have all day to serve you." From a distance, Helena caught Rosa subtly tightening her grip on her sleeve. The injustice was laid bare, enough to anger even those who knew the law well, despite their disguises. Vikram stood nearby and drew a glance from Halford, but the officer ignored him, perhaps judging him weak enough not to be worth the trouble. Halford's choice of target revealed a predator's instinct. He went after those he believed he could crush. At the very moment Helena straightened up, a white man behind her stepped forward. Halford instantly changed his tone. "Sir, please go ahead." His voice turned smooth and pliant, forming a painful contrast with the words he had used on Helena. The man thanked him and passed through the gate, seemingly unaware of the stark contrast unfolding behind him. Helena took in that attitude and felt anger condense into heat, spreading across her chest. But she stayed silent. The most dangerous thing now was to let emotion tear apart the cover she had built. When Helena asked, "Which way do I go to reach courtroom 3?" Halford slowly turned his head, his eyes roaming over her face before he replied, "Do you understand English? Or do I need to speak in whatever language your slum uses?" Everyone nearby, including the disguised members of her group, heard it clearly. Carl tilted his head, jotting something down, while Vikram lowered his gaze, avoiding Halford's attention. Helena felt her shoulders twitch as military police instincts ran up her spine. During her time in uniform, she had faced men who threatened her comrades with the same look. But this was not the moment to react. She controlled her breathing, listening to her heart pound hard before gradually settling. Someone who has walked through battlefields knows how to press anger into a sealed corner of the heart, waiting for a more fitting moment. As Helena took a few steps forward, he moved in close to her ear again, his voice low but sharp. "Once you're inside, behave yourself. Or you might disappear without knowing when it happened." The words did not sound like a warning, but like something he had seen happen before. Helena froze for a single beat, feeling a chill from the hallway brush across the back of her neck. The threat slid smoothly like a blade, slicing through the boundary between her role and the brutal reality of Eastbrook. Helena walked on without looking back. Behind her, Halford moved toward another group, his figure like a dark shadow weaving among the vulnerable. Rosa watched quietly, lips pressed tight, while Carl angled his body to keep distance and avoid Halford's gaze. Helena had barely stepped past the gate when Halford abruptly called her back. He thrust out his hand, signaling another round of inspection. His voice retained its metallic edge, ordering her to remove her shoes, take off her belt, and unpack her bag again. Helena cast a glance toward the three disguised legislators. Carl narrowed his eyes in alert caution. Rosa lowered her gaze as if holding her breath, while Vikram stepped half a pace back to create a safer distance. They could not intervene, but all of them understood that Halford was deliberately prolonging the inspection to torment someone he had chosen as a favored target. Halford snarled each word, asking whether she was ready. Helena did not answer, simply placing her shoes and belt onto the tray as instructed. He lifted her bag, shook it hard to see if anything would fall out, then dropped it with enough force that the edge struck the table. Helena watched it fall, her palms tightening slightly. If he kept pushing, she would not be able to maintain this role much longer. But at the very moment the tension peaked, a young male voice, steady and clear, cut in from the hallway. "That's enough, Halford." The voice was not loud, yet it sliced cleanly through the brutality hanging in the air. Helena looked up. A young man stepped out from a corner, his stride confident without arrogance. It was Marcus Hale. He wore a simple moss-green suit, not the sharply pressed style of prosecutors seen on television, but one tailored for someone who spent long hours moving between courtrooms and file rooms. Marcus stopped a few steps from Halford, his gaze fixed on him, not hostile but unmistakably disapproving. Halford tilted his head, lips curling into a mocking grin. "Oh, our star prosecutor, do you have something to say?" The way he drew out the word star was bitter and loaded, as if reminding Marcus that in Eastbrook no one was truly a star except those who knew when to bow their heads. Marcus replied succinctly, "They are here to observe. Let them through." He did not raise his voice, but the firmness of his words forced Halford to rein in some of his aggression. Halford snorted softly, knowing that arguing now would not serve him. He shoved the bag back toward Helena with a heavy slap onto the table, sending it sliding half a hand's breadth. Then he shot Marcus a glance sharp as a blade before turning to the group behind to continue harassing his next victim. Marcus remained still for a few seconds, waiting until the sound of Halford's boots faded. He inclined his head toward Helena. The moment was brief, but there was something in his eyes that was difficult to decipher. It was not ordinary curiosity, nor the probing look of someone evaluating a stranger. It was the gaze of someone who sensed that she was not entirely like the others around her. Marcus kept his thoughts to himself. He spoke quietly, just loud enough for Helena to hear, but not for Halford or anyone else. "If you're going to courtroom 3, prepare yourself. The law there is not what you've read about." Helena paused slightly at his words. Courtroom 3 was exactly where she was headed. And it was also the place most frequently cited for abuses of power. Marcus delivered the line in a low voice, without menace. It sounded more like a warning from someone who had stood in the middle of a hailstorm watching it strike others while being unable to pull them away. Helena gave a small nod. Neither of them wanted to draw attention. The fact that Marcus had chosen to speak to her at all signaled that he understood how dangerous this place truly was. Marcus turned and walked into the long corridor ahead. After only a few steps, he stopped, tilted his head, and added one more sentence, just loud enough for the two of them. "Be careful of Officer Bradley Kane." The moment the name left his mouth, Helena felt a cold current run along the back of her neck. That name had appeared in several complaint letters she had read. People wrote of an officer who shoved, threatened, and even choked defendants when few were watching. One person had called him a shadow in the courtroom. Helena kept her expression neutral, but inside, her vigilance rose sharply to a new level. Marcus did not look back again. He disappeared at the turn ahead, his back dissolving into the pale hallway light, like the end of a rare moment of calm. Helena retrieved her shoes and bag, put them on, and moved forward. When she glanced to either side, she saw Carl still standing in his original position, lowering his phone as if he had just finished an important recording. Rosa gave her a slight nod, just enough to confirm they were still safe. Vikram edged forward, creating distance before Halford's attention could settle on him again. Helena proceeded deeper into the corridor, where the worn stone floor echoed hollowly beneath each step. Yellowed wall panels made the hallway seem endless. Lights flickered, and the footsteps of others bounced back in broken sounds. Helena felt the shift in the air distinctly. What Halford had done was only the beginning of the iceberg. Marcus's warning about Courtroom 3 was like a door opening onto a place where the law was twisted to serve the will of the powerful. Courtroom 3 opened like a box, dense with years of suppressed breathing. The room was cramped and low, harsh white light from the ceiling fixtures shining straight down onto rows of peeling wooden benches that looked more like restraints in a detention facility than seating for the public. The air was heavy with the smell of damp paper, sweat, and a fatigue so prolonged that it was impossible to tell whether today was a new hearing or merely a continuation of countless days before it. As Helena stepped inside, she felt the silence seal behind her like a metal door, and she knew she had entered a place where the words of the law had lost their meaning. On the raised bench, Judge Harold Crane leaned slightly forward, his hands clasped together, his eyes fixed on the crowd with a mixture of weariness and irritation. Each time his gaze shifted, the impatience in his eyes became more pronounced. The overhead lights cast a pallid glow across his face, revealing the deep-set lines of a man long accustomed to tossing down rulings as one would throw stones into a dry well. Helena recognized that look from many judges she had confronted before, but in Crane it was sharper, more openly contemptuous, as if the people in the courtroom were a burden rather than citizens deserving protection. Below, beside the defendant's table, Bradley Kane stood with one hand resting against the chair. He made no effort to hide his boredom, yet the slight lean of his body cast a kind of shadow over the man seated next to him. Jonathan Reyes, middle-aged and gaunt, to the point that his shirt collar hung loose, his hands trembling in small, steady pulses, as though enduring a cold no one else could see. Watching from the back row of the gallery, Helena saw clearly how Reyes's shoulders drew inward each time Bradley shifted a foot closer. Reyes's body reacted like that of someone long accustomed to pain, where even the lightest touch was enough to awaken buried memories. Reyes tried to speak when Crane asked about his previous statement, but the moment his cracked lips parted, Bradley placed a heavy hand against his back. A touch applied just softly enough to avoid noise, yet firmly enough to make Reyes swallow whatever he had intended to say. Helena saw that the silence that followed did not come from simple fear, but from an obsession rooted deep within the man. Someone detained for years might live with familiar terror, but someone held for only a few days who shook like this meant something had happened to him in that short span. What sent a chill down Helena's spine was not Bradley's action, but the fact that Crane did not even bother to acknowledge it, as though such behavior were normal in Courtroom 3. Helena glanced toward the left corner of the room. The three disguised legislators blended into the crowd. Carl sat among construction workers, Rosa was pressed in with a group of female observers, and Vikram was wedged between two elderly men. None of them looked directly at Helena, but each carried a quiet vigilance directed toward the defendant's table where Bradley stood. Helena could feel that everyone was waiting for something, yet no one could do anything except maintain the cover they had assumed. When Helena returned her gaze to the bench, she caught a moment in which Crane was engaging with a group of white spectators seated in the front row. He gave them a slight nod, listened to a few whispered words, and allowed the corner of his mouth to lift in a thin gesture of courtesy. But when he turned toward the poorer observers, his face dropped into icy indifference. No explanation was needed. That look alone told Helena how Crane categorized people in this courtroom. Power in Eastbrook did not reside in the law, but in the faces of those standing before it. A court employee passed behind Helena and murmured to a colleague, his voice low but clear enough for her to hear, "This room has its own rules. If you want to survive, do not talk too much." The words cut through her like a cold draft. Helena did not turn her head, yet it felt as though the tiled floor beneath her feet had suddenly sagged. Courtroom 3 was not merely mismanaged. It was governed by an unspoken code strong enough to make even courthouse staff afraid to breathe too loudly. Crane closed the file before him and looked up at the crowd. He said, "I hope no one makes me waste more time today. I do not tolerate chaos from people who do not know how to keep their mouths shut." His eyes swept across the room as if scanning for irritants. His voice was cold and sharp, each word dropping like the edge of a blade. The statement was aimed at no one in particular, yet everyone understood who it was meant for. People like Reyes. People like Helena, in disguise. The entire courtroom seemed to tighten, the air thinning, making it difficult for those packed onto the wooden benches to draw a deep breath. Helena felt her spine tense, as if a current of electricity had run through it. It was not fear, but the stark awareness that she had stepped into the core of a form of power that had slipped beyond the control of the law. She had witnessed abuse within the military, but never at this level inside a state courtroom. Here, the law was bent, withheld, and thrown against the wall. The air in courtroom 3 was already heavy, but when Bradley Kane leaned close to Jonathan Reyes's ear, the entire room seemed to sink several degrees colder. He placed a hand on Reyes's shoulder, tilted his head slightly downward, his voice low and sharp like a cold blade. "Shut your mouth! Do you want to follow the guy in holding cell 6? The words fell so softly that no one would think they had heard them. Yet they carried enough weight to slam the whole room into a nameless darkness. Reyes's back arched instinctively in avoidance, as if he had just heard something that had haunted him through long nights in the holding facility. Reyes gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. His entire arm trembled faintly, trembling like an overstretched string on the verge of snapping. His eyes twitched in short pulses as Bradley withdrew his hand, as though that single sentence had struck the deepest terror buried inside him. Helena sat behind him, maintaining a composed exterior. Yet she caught fragments drifting through the air. Cell 6. Dead. The sound was incomplete, but it was enough for someone with a military police background to understand that this was not the sort of casual threat officers used to assert authority. Behind it lay something murkier, heavier, something capable of driving a person to the edge of despair. Bradley straightened up, tilting his head down at Reyes with a look of enjoyment. He slapped Reyes's shoulder hard, as one might pat a compliant animal. "Be smart and keep your mouth shut," he said, dragging out the final word just enough to turn it into an order. Helena saw clearly that this was not merely an officer threatening a defendant, but a guard bearing his fangs at captive prey. Anger surged in waves inside her, but she pressed her hand lightly against the edge of the bench, forcing the emotion to stay still, because any slip now could shatter her cover and the mission itself. At the back of the room, one observer whispered to the person beside him, "Something happened in cell 6 again?" His voice quivered slightly, like someone who had heard too many terrible things but dared not confirm them. The other shook his head slowly. "Do not mention it. I do not want trouble." They fell silent immediately afterward, their eyes fixed on the bench like people accustomed to living under a dark shadow and knowing exactly what it took to stay alive. Those whispers were like rumors circulating through a poor neighborhood, things everyone knew but no one dared say aloud. Judge Crane continued flipping through his files, utterly unresponsive to what was unfolding before him. His eyes moved steadily across the pages, never dropping to the image of Reyes shrinking beneath Bradley's hand. Helena saw it clearly. In this courtroom, intimidation had become part of the procedure. Crane did not need to look, did not need to confirm, because he had allowed Bradley to rule the defendant's table with threats in place of the law. A chill ran down Helena's spine once more, this time not from concern for the mission, but from a harsher truth. Courtroom 3 was no longer a place of judgment. It was a place where things the city wanted erased were quietly disposed of. Reyes struggled to draw breath, his lungs compressing like a damp cloth. He tried to speak when Crane questioned him again, but Bradley reached up and pinched the base of his neck, precisely the spot anyone who had ever been restrained would recognize as a point of warning. The touch caused no pain, yet it sent a signal through his entire body. Reyes nearly went numb. He swallowed his answer, his shoulders collapsing as if broken from within. Helena watched closely, noticing a strange silence spreading through the surrounding benches. It was not the silence of respect, nor the silence of order. It was the silence of people who had witnessed too many similar scenes and understood that reacting would only make them the next target. Silence was the only armor they had left. She realized that this collective muteness was itself part of the rot consuming Eastbrook. The law was bent by fear, and fear was sustained by people like Bradley. The white light from the ceiling continued to fall evenly across Reyes's face, revealing the veins standing out along his temples. Small ticking sounds from the old air conditioner on the wall echoed like someone tapping in anticipation. Helena noticed Reyes's sleeve shaking more violently now, nearly out of control. He was being compressed inward. And when a person is driven all the way to the wall, they no longer know what might burst out. Bradley caught Helena's eye for a brief instant. He did not recognize her, but one eyebrow lifted slightly. There was something in his gaze that told her he had sensed a quiet vigilance. He glanced at her, as if to memorize her face for later scrutiny. Helena kept her expression neutral, lowering her eyes slightly to avoid drawing attention. Yet she felt her chest tighten, like a bow pulled far past its limit. Reyes clenched his fists, his lips pressed together until they split and bled. Then, suddenly, he let out a broken gasp, as though his body could no longer endure the pressure of the threat. What happened next rocked the entire courtroom. He screamed, his voice splintering like rotten wood split in two. "I do not want to die like the man in holding cell 6. I know what you do in there. It's Argon." The scream slammed into the four walls and rebounded, making the thick air shudder with each echo. The observers froze, some turning their heads toward the door as if searching for an escape. Bradley halted for half a second before his face flushed red with fury. Helena did not move, but her heart pounded against her chest. That sentence was not merely a plea. It was a signal unlocking a secret buried in the dark for far too long, now bursting open in a desperate bid for survival. The room hardened into stillness for several seconds. No one spoke. No one dared breathe too loudly. Helena realized that she had just stepped from the edge of observation straight into the very center of something that would alter her entire covert investigation. Jonathan Reyes's scream still vibrated in the air like twisted metal, producing a jagged echo that brought all of courtroom 3 to a halt. No one moved. Not even the observers who were accustomed to shouting, arguments, and heavy sentences delivered within minutes. The shock of that scream seemed to drag every gaze straight toward the gaunt man, gasping at the defendant's table. Helena felt as if the walls of the courtroom were closing in, forcing everything toward the center where Reyes struggled to breathe. The truth that had just escaped his mouth made the air grow even denser. Bradley Kane flinched slightly at the sudden scream. The startle lasted only half a second, but as if to compensate, his face flushed red with rage. He clamped his hand down hard on Reyes's shoulder, wrinkling the fabric of the man's shirt beneath the force of his grip. The gesture was a naked threat. offered without any attempt at concealment. Helena could see the tendons standing out along Bradley's neck, his face drawn tight as though he might explode at any moment. Reyes tried to inhale, but his breath shattered. He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again, as if his lungs were no longer functioning properly. When his voice finally emerged, it was hoarse and thin, like paper stretched too far. "I do not want to die." Each word fell like a heavy stone onto the stone floor, and Helena felt a chill run down her spine. The fear in his voice was not the fear of conviction. It was the fear of someone who knew death was approaching and could not escape it. Behind him, a female observer raised a hand to cover her mouth. She leaned her head toward the person beside her and whispered, "Another one. After cell 6. Though her voice was low, the fear embedded in each word spread through the benches like a poisonous draft. A few others lowered their heads, avoiding the defendant's table altogether. That avoidance spoke volumes about what they had seen or heard before. Cell 6 was a place no one wanted mentioned, let alone entered. Judge Harold Crane slammed his gavel down hard, the wood striking the bench with a shrill crack that made several people jump. "Order," he barked, his voice pressed down as if to crush every emotion in the room. "If the defendant shouts one more word, I will have him detained immediately." The sentence fell cold as ice, and to Helena it sounded less like a warning than a gift to Bradley, a form of silent consent. Crane's eyes showed no interest in understanding what had driven Reyes to such terror. He wanted only to keep the courtroom running according to his will, no matter if that meant burying the truth. Reyes turned his head, his bloodshot eyes searching for Helena as though for a fragile anchor. That look tightened her chest, as if in that instant he had placed his life in her hands, whether she understood what he was trying to say. No words passed between them, yet the plea was stronger than anything spoken. She held his gaze briefly, not long enough to draw attention, but long enough for him to know he was not entirely alone. Bradley bent low, leaning close to Reyes's ear. "Keep your mouth shut," he said, his voice quiet, yet the blade in his words sharp enough to cut the air. "If you want to walk out on your own 2 legs." Each syllable, each breath from Bradley, poured more fuel onto Reyes's panic. He spoke like a man who held authority over life and death. He spoke as if holding cell 6 were something he could unlock at will. Helena watched Bradley's hand slide along the back of Reyes's neck, a small movement loaded with menace, the gesture of someone about to cross a line, not written in any rulebook. She focused intensely, memorizing every motion, every inch of space between their bodies, every strained breath Reyes took. Those details would matter later if she gathered evidence. What unsettled Helena was not what Bradley was about to do, but how natural his preparation seemed, as though this were something he had done hundreds of times without ever being questioned. A male observer leaned back abruptly, as if trying to escape the steel wire tension coiled around the defendant's table. "Is cell 6 really that terrifying?" he whispered. The person beside him drew in a shaky breath. "You do not want to know." They fell silent immediately afterward, as if the very words they had spoken had violated something forbidden. Helena noticed the courtroom door tremble slightly as a police officer passed outside. The sound of boots striking the hallway floor echoed in a steady rhythm, like time counting down toward the next eruption. She looked up at the bench and saw Crane's eyes narrow, not out of concern for the accusation, but from a desire to seize control of the proceedings again. The only nerve still fully alive in him was the nerve of power. Reyes tried to lean back, but the chair was pinned against the table, leaving him nowhere to go. His voice burst out, distorted. "They kill people and hide the bodies." He choked, then, as if forced by an unseen pressure, pushed on. "Cell 6 has no cameras." Each word flew out like a stone hurled from a cliff, dropping deep into the numbing air of the courtroom. That statement tore through the silence that had already been stretched to its limit. An observer dropped a pen. A man muttered a curse under his breath. Rosa, seated 3 rows away, leaned forward, her eyes wide. Vikram turned his head toward Helena, their gazes meeting for a split second in shared realization. This was no longer merely a case of misconduct. This was an accusation of murder. Helena felt her hand clench until it ached. She realized the storm she had been seeking was no longer ahead of her. It was already inside the courtroom. Reyes was no longer just a frightened man. He was someone who had opened a door, exposing a secret the entire courthouse had tried to bury. And in that moment, she understood that what was coming next could no longer be avoided. The air in courtroom 3, after Reyes's scream, was stretched so tight that a single small movement felt enough to shatter the entire room. Helena stood up at the exact moment Bradley tightened his grip on Reyes's shoulder, and her voice cut through the tension, sharp yet controlled. "Officer, you are threatening the defendant in front of the judge." The words made several observers jolt and turn toward her, as if unable to believe that an ordinary woman would dare speak like that in a place ruled by dark power. Helena kept her back straight, her shoulders steady, her voice carrying the calm of someone who understood every boundary of the law, and also understood the warning voice of instinct. Bradley turned his head immediately, his eyes narrowing as if he had just spotted a new prey in a room he was accustomed to ruling without challenge. He looked her up and down, his gaze openly contemptuous, then said in a voice thick with provocation, "What did you say?" The emphasis he placed on the word "you" lingered slightly, as though he meant to tear Helena's very existence apart with tone alone. Helena did not step back. She held her ground, her breathing even. "Take your hand off him. This is not your prison." The words were simple, yet they drove straight into the air like a blade. People seated behind her leaned forward, sensing they were about to witness something no one had ever dared attempt before. A young woman quietly tugged at the arm of the person beside her. Whether as a warning or in search of reassurance, it was impossible to tell. Bradley left his position and walked straight toward Helena. He moved like an animal accustomed to attacking, each step short and heavy. When he came close, the smell of tobacco mixed with sweat rose from him, and Helena could feel the hostility seeping from his body. He stopped inches from her face, his voice slipping through clenched teeth. "Here, I make the law. What does a woman, as you know?" His breath washed over her. Hot, heavy, and saturated with rage, the courtroom sank into a taut silence. No one dared stand. No one dared object. They watched, as if witnessing an accident about to happen, powerless to save the person being threatened. Carl shifted slightly, but Rosa placed a hand on his shoulder, reminding him to stay in character. Vikram tilted his head just enough, his eyes fixed on Helena with silent concern. Helena did not move, but her right hand curled almost imperceptibly, a telltale sign of years of reflex training in military police service. "Officer," she said, her voice lower now but every word firm, "you are crossing the line." Bradley did not listen. Or perhaps he did, and chose to ignore it to display his dominance. He thrust his hand forward and shoved her shoulder. The push was not strong enough to injure, but it carried enough force to make her stagger for a brief beat. And that single touch drew soft gasps from a few observers. He touched her. Bradley barked, his voice thick with satisfaction. "You do not have the right to stand here." He shoved her again, trying to force her back, trying to make her submit the way he was used to making others obey. To Bradley, Helena was not a person. She was merely a woman of color, standing in the wrong place and speaking at the wrong time. That insult, combined with the contact from a filthy hand of power, made Helena feel the boundary vanish completely. From that instant, she understood that she was no longer just an observer. She was standing in the role of a victim. One Bradley believed he could crush the same way he crushed those weaker than himself. Bradley ground his teeth and stepped even closer. "Let me show you where you belong," he said, reaching out, his fingers tightening in preparation to grab her collar and yank her forward in the same way he used to restrain detainees. The moment Bradley's hand touched Helena's collar, her eyes darkened. A familiar stillness flooded her, so deep that for an instant she heard nothing except the rush of blood in her ears. It was the signal of an instinct honed in military police service, an instinct that had slept for many years, making room for the composure of a legislator, now snapped awake like a switch slammed on. Helena's body reacted before her reason spoke. Her foot shifted slightly to find balance, her spine straightened, her shoulders dropped, and her eyes locked onto the center of Bradley's chest. She did not strike yet, but the strike had already formed in her bloodstream, waiting for Bradley to pull just one beat harder before it exploded outward. In that brief moment, the entire room seemed to collapse into a single point, the place where Bradley's hand clutched Helena's collar. An elderly observer half rose, then immediately sat back down, afraid his movement might be misinterpreted. Another person held their breath. Rosa gripped the edge of her bench. Carl pressed a hand to his chest, as if feeling his own heartbeat falter. Vikram, from farther away, tilted his head almost imperceptibly, sending a wordless signal. "Hold steady, Helena." Bradley curled his lip, preparing to yank her forward. But there was something he did not know. The woman standing before him was not a fragile observer, not a mother attending a hearing, not a target for his rage. She was a warrior, trained to survive on the battlefield, a warrior who had buried her instincts to serve a greater mission. The moment Bradley's fingers tightened around Helena's collar, the final hinge of her restraint snapped open. He yanked hard, pulling her body forward with enough force to make an ordinary person stumble. But Helena was not the ordinary person he imagined. In a fraction of a second before he could shout, her arm rotated instinctively, the reflex of someone forged through years in military police service. The punch came out clean, fast, and viciously precise, like a survival response honed over time. The sound that rang out when Helena's fist struck Bradley's jaw was a dry, cracking thud, loud enough to make even those at the far end of the courtroom flinch. It was not a booming noise, but it carried the force and sharpness of a blade. It echoed through the room like the first sound of a truth long suppressed, finally shattering the shell of silence. Many had not even fully seen the movement, but the sound alone told them something monumental had just happened. Bradley flew backward as if yanked by a steel cable. His back slammed into the wooden benches behind him, producing a heavy crash like the sound of a body hitting the floor in a detention block. His head struck the edge of a bench, knocking his crooked cap loose. It fell and rolled across the floor. His mouth hung open, lips trembling, but no words came out. His eyes were wide, blood vessels blooming red across the whites, as if he had just been struck by a force outside the world he controlled. A female observer screamed and then clapped a hand over her mouth. A man jumped to his feet, pulling 2 or 3 others with him. Whether out of fear or disbelief, it was impossible to tell. Some leaned back against their benches, staring at Helena as if witnessing something they had never seen in their lives. Someone daring to stand against Bradley in the middle of courtroom 3. Helena stood upright, her breathing steady, her eyes unblinking. Not a single wasted movement. No flinch, no tremor. That absolute control caused the air around her to sink into a brief, stunned pause. Ortiz, standing closest, felt a chill run down his spine. He did not understand how this woman could remain so composed in a moment when others would have collapsed in terror. Helena's gaze was cold and focused, the look of someone who had been through battlefields and knew that any unnecessary motion could mean death. Judge Crane slammed his gavel down hard, his voice crashing through the room like metal thrown onto tile. "Officer! Handcuff her immediately! This is an assault on an officer inside the courtroom." His voice rang with fury. But that fury was not directed at the blow Helena had landed. It came from the fact that the order he had built was being destroyed in front of so many witnesses. Two officers rushed toward Helena almost simultaneously, their boots pounding against the stone floor in harsh, frantic rhythm. But Helena did not move. As they closed in, she spoke, her voice so calm it made one of the officers hesitate for half a beat. "He attacked me first. The camera on the ceiling recorded everything. Review the footage." The words were not loud, but they dropped into the chaos with the weight of truth. Her statement caused several people to instinctively lift their heads. Their eyes went to the corner of the ceiling in courtroom 3, where a small black camera glowed with a red light. Not a broken camera, not a disabled one, a recording camera, a living piece of evidence, an eye that could not lie. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted instantly. Some people drew deep breaths, as if realizing they were witnessing something capable of overturning the reality they had been forced to accept for so long. Others exchanged glances that seemed to ask, "The camera still works?" Because in Eastbrook, cameras rarely captured the moments that truly mattered. Ortiz looked at the camera, then at Helena, then at Bradley sprawled on the floor, his face twisted in pain. In that moment, Ortiz felt his heart pounding like a drum inside his chest. He had seen things he was never meant to see. He had heard threats he was never meant to hear. He had watched Bradley shove detainees, choke them in camera blind spots, more times than he could count. But this time, the camera was not off, and Helena was not the kind of person who could be silenced. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. His hands trembled slightly as he looked back at Helena, standing like a steel pillar in the middle of the courtroom. Ortiz understood that the choice he made in this instant would change his life. Either he stayed silent, as he had for years, or he spoke and shattered the circle of silence he himself had helped maintain. Bradley struggled to rise, his voice cracked with pain and humiliation. "Cuff her." But Ortiz did not move. He stood still, his feet planted as if fused to the tile floor. His breath pressed hard against his chest. His eyes lifted to the camera, then returned to Helena, and finally turned toward Crane. And for the first time in his life, Ortiz chose to step past the fear that had weighed on him for years. His voice came out, trembling slightly, but unmistakably clear. "Officer Bradley attacked first." It was not loud, but in a room accustomed to the sound of threats, Ortiz's words struck like a blow against the standing silence. Each word landed, each one peeling back another layer of darkness inside courtroom 3. The observers let out small gasps, not in noise but in shock. Crane stopped breathing for half a beat, his eyes widening. Bradley snapped his head toward Ortiz with murderous fury. But everyone had heard it. It could not be taken back. It could not be erased. The moment Ortiz spoke, courtroom 3 was torn out of its familiar orbit. He stood with his back straight, his hands trembling slightly, yet his gaze fixed directly on Judge Crane. "I saw everything." Bradley attacked first. His voice wavered only at the opening sound, then grew clearer and firmer with each word, as if every syllable were a stone dropped straight onto the cold stone floor. The silence that followed was like the pause after thunder. Everyone heard it. No one could pretend they had not. A murmur rose from the back rows, not loud but rapid, like wind rushing through a narrow crack. Another officer stepped close to Ortiz, tugging lightly at his uniform as if trying to pull him back toward the rear of the room, whispering urgently, "Are you crazy?" His voice cracked with panic. Ortiz did not step back. He only tilted his head, his expression hardening. Years of service had taught him how to bury every emotion. But now he no longer hid them. The uniform on his body felt unbearably heavy beneath the eyes of so many witnesses. Bradley was still on the floor, struggling to push himself up. He braced one hand against the ground, his face flushed with pain and humiliation. When he heard Ortiz's statement, his eyes bulged. The whites streaked red like blood. "Traitor!" he roared, the sound harsh and jagged. "I will kill you!" His breath came fast, his words hissing through clenched teeth. The threat sounding like it came from a cornered animal. He forced himself to his feet, only to collapse again at once, the chair behind him shuddering violently. Ortiz retreated half a step by reflex, but no farther. He stopped, clenching one fist at his side. His eyes burned red, not only from fear of Bradley, but from years crushed beneath that man's power. Old memories surged through him. The time Bradley forced Ortiz to falsify a report, the time he threatened to transfer Ortiz to the violent offenders block if he did not cooperate. The time Ortiz watched a man beaten until blood poured from his nose and dared not intervene. All of it coiled inside him like a steel cable pulled taut. This time, the cable did not snap. It recoiled. Judge Crane slammed his gavel repeatedly, the sound echoing but swallowed by the chaos spreading through the room. "Silence," he shouted, his voice overpowering many, yet unable to drown out the truth. Ortiz had spoken. "I did not authorize anyone to make statements." He struck the gavel again, his face beginning to pale, not from anger, but from fear of something slipping beyond his control. The power he had guarded for years had just been pierced for the first time. And that wound came from someone he had always considered easiest to control. Helena looked at Ortiz, her eyes not those of a victor, but of someone who understood that a life had just stepped onto the front line, where truth and death can be separated by a single breath. She gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible. It was not encouragement, but acknowledgement. In that moment, Ortiz was no longer a supporting officer. He had become the most crucial witness to the truth. Ortiz drew a deep breath, then spoke again, stronger now, louder. "I am willing to sign a report. I will not stay silent anymore." His voice was hard as metal. Not a single word trembled. The sentence shot across the room, through the old walls of Eastbrook, like an arrow. Several observers inhaled sharply. Others turned to look at one another, as if checking whether they had heard correctly. No one had believed Ortiz would dare repeat it in front of both Crane and Bradley. A man seated in the last row whispered, "Someone finally dared to tell the truth." The words rippled outward like a wave. No one dared speak loudly, but their eyes had changed. The fear that had crusted over the walls of this courtroom for years began to flake away. A young woman sitting beside Rosa clenched her hands until blue veins stood out and murmured, "Oh my God." Someone stood up. For the first time, the silence of courtroom 3 was not born of fear, but of a fragile hope just beginning to ignite. Crane sprang to his feet, his judicial robe brushing the desk with a rasping sound. He stared at Ortiz, as if at a flame that had just ignited on the carpet. "Officer Ortiz," he snapped, "you are violating procedure." But Ortiz answered with silence, a kind of silence Crane had never expected. The silence of defiance. The silence of truth refuses to retreat. The other officers in the room began to stir. Two people standing behind the bench exchanged frightened glances. Everyone understood that if Ortiz spoke, if a report was filed, if the camera footage showed Bradley attacking first, no one within the Eastbrook system would keep their position as before. Someone muttered, "This is a disaster." But it was already too late to turn back. Above the courtroom ceiling, the small black camera continued to glow red, capturing everything. The punch, the threats, the accusation, and Ortiz's testimony. Helena felt the shift clearly. Eastbrook was cracking. Not wide, but real. And the first crack is always the most important. On the second floor of the courthouse, the security control room lit up with blinking red indicators. The central monitor displayed a warning message. "Anomaly detected. Courtroom 3. A security technician stared at the screen, his heart pounding, then hurriedly picked up the phone. The artificial intelligence system Graves had installed for special monitoring had begun detecting an irregularity. Inside the spacious walnut-paneled office of the state Supreme Court, where the walls were lined with portraits of former Chief Justices, Milton Graves was reviewing the morning reports when the auxiliary screen beside him shifted from yellow to red. The red band crept along the lower edge of the display in steady increments, glowing like a streak of dragged blood. Graves narrowed his eyes, set his coffee cup down, and tilted his head slightly to look more closely. He had installed a private alert system, separate from the state's standard security network, and red was its highest level of severity. In all the years since its installation, he had never seen it activate at Eastbrook. He enlarged the alert window. The text appeared clearly: Courtroom. 3 abnormal volume, spike potential conflict. It meant the artificial intelligence was not analyzing images, but the volume level, frequency of confrontation, and abnormal shouting were enough for it to flag a risk beyond threshold. Graves pushed his chair closer to the screen, tapping a finger lightly on the desk. Eastbrook was a courthouse he had always believed he controlled absolutely, and Courtroom 3, with Crane presiding, was supposed to be the safest room by his definition of the word, a place where everything unfolded exactly as he had arranged on the board. Graves lifted the desk phone. He spoke slowly but firmly. "Connect me to Harold Crane." A second later, he added, "My order. Suspend the trial immediately. Log the reason as an emergency administrative matter." His voice carried no hesitation. The authority in every word spread like a layer of cold glass over the entire call. The assistant on the other end managed only, "Yes, Chief Justice," before moving to carry out the order. In Courtroom 3, the internal phone rang abruptly, shrill and grating, cutting straight through the shouting, fractured breathing, and chaos caused by Helena's punch. The ring sounded 3 times, each tone like a metal strike against Crane's temples. He turned his head, a flash of irritation mixed with alarm crossing his face. Never had he wanted to ignore a call more than at this moment, but this was a line he could not refuse. Crane picked up, forcing his voice into composure. "Courtroom 3, Crane speaking." The response on the other end was brief and cold. "Suspend the trial immediately." Crane's entire body stiffened. No name was necessary. Graves's voice was unmistakable to anyone within the state's legal system. Crane heard him add, "Emergency administrative grounds. No delay." Then the line went dead, as clean and swift as a blade sliding back into its sheath. Crane lowered the receiver slowly, but the color drained from his face at once. The power he had leaned on for years now bound his hands instead. He dared not argue, dared not stall. He stood, adjusting his judicial robe as if trying to salvage what little authority remained. His hands trembled faintly, but he forced his voice into the posture of someone still wielding the gavel. "The trial is suspended immediately. Everyone, remain in place." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. People looked at one another in confusion, unsure what had just happened. Some thought it was a maneuver by Crane to protect Bradley. Others sensed something far more serious unfolding above their heads. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, trying to guess what this order meant for their futures. Bradley, still sitting on the floor, face twisted with rage, shouted, "Suspend what? Cuff her!" But his voice dissolved into the noise, and no one responded. Ortiz stepped back half a pace, looking like a man who had just signed his own death warrant. He swallowed heavily, eyes flicking to Helena, and then toward the door. He knew that once Graves intervened, the matter had moved far beyond a single courtroom. Those who testified against this structure never met easy endings, but Ortiz did not retract his words. His face hardened, not from bravery, but from resolve. If he gave in to fear now, he would never lift his head again for the rest of his life. Helena stood amid the clamor. She did not retreat. She did not tremble. On the contrary, it confirmed what she had anticipated. They had struck the nerve of a man who had built an entire career on courtrooms like this one. Graves was doing what powerful figures do when they sense a system about to fracture, freezing everything in place long enough to patch the damage. Helena looked up at the ceiling camera. The red light was still on. She knew that among all the courtrooms at Eastbrook, Courtroom 3 was the one Graves had always wanted to control most tightly. If the artificial intelligence had raised an alert, then Graves had certainly received it. What he did not know was this. The footage had already been running long enough for Marcus Hale, out in the hallway, to back it up onto his own device. Helena did not know that detail, but instinctively, she sensed the truth had been preserved before any hand could reach in to erase it. At the back of the courtroom, Carl, Rosa, and Vikram held firmly to their disguises. Yet Helena could see the tension in their eyes. All three understood that a suspension order from Graves was never trivial. It meant something was rising to the surface that the system wanted buried as fast as possible. Crane struck the gavel twice more, the sharp cracks as if trying to drown chaos with authority. "Everyone, remain where you are," he barked. But in his voice, Helena heard the tremor of a man placed under a trump card he himself had helped build with unwavering loyalty. He scanned the room, then turned toward Bradley, who was still struggling to stand, swaying, his face flushed with humiliation. Crane muttered through clenched teeth. "Quiet. Do not cause more trouble," the tone of a subordinate delivering instructions. Back in the state Supreme Court office, Graves braced one hand on the desk, eyes fixed on the blinking red reports. He turned to his assistant, voice low and icy. "Retrieve all hallway security equipment. We must control this before anyone understands what holding cell 6 is." The assistant's eyes widened, his breath catching. But Graves did not wait for a response. He knew cell 6 was the one weakness capable of collapsing the entire network he had built over 10 years. He walked to the large glass window overlooking the city of Albany, stretched out beneath a thin veil of morning haze. Hundreds of cars moved below, like small fish swimming under glass. He murmured, not to anyone in particular, "It must not come out. Never." At that very moment, a security technician on a lower floor had begun removing a backup storage unit. One link in the chain of concealment had been activated. But none of them knew that the truth had already slipped free. At the exact second, Helena threw her punch. The crowd forced out of the courtroom formed a swirling current of chaos along the hallway. Rapid footsteps, sharp breaths, and tense murmurs broke into fragments of sound that collided against the cold stone walls. The smell of sweat, old paper, and a panic laced with fragile hope rose like steam before a storm. People pressed past one another, some turning their heads to look back, as if needing confirmation that what had just happened was not an illusion. The courtroom was closed, but the aftershock inside still carried the full force of something Eastbrook had never seen before. Bradley was hauled to his feet by two officers, his body swaying. One cheek was bruised and swollen, his jaw aching enough to twist his speech. He tried to shout, but only a hoarse rasp came out. "That bitch. I'll deal with you." He lifted a hand to point at Helena, but it shook from pain and fear. A nearby civilian stepped back by instinct, yet his eyes did not waver. No one looked at Bradley as untouchable anymore. Helena walked out of the courtroom with a composure so complete that those around her could not read a single emotion on her face. She scanned the crowd and saw eyes filled half with fear, half with expectation turned toward her. They did not dare celebrate, but something in their gaze had already separated itself from despair. Helena kept her breathing even, sensing that her role had moved beyond investigation. She had become the first living proof that an abuser of power could be stopped on the spot. At the far end of the hallway, Marcus Hale moved quickly, almost at a run. He knew that if the technical team removed the hard drives, all camera footage would vanish within minutes. Marcus pushed open the door to the technical room, a wave of cold air from the machines washing over him and sending a shiver through his body. 3 technicians stood around the control cabinet, hands gripping protective cases for the drives. They looked at him as if he were the most inconvenient interruption imaginable. Marcus did not change his expression. "Give me 1 minute." He stepped straight to the workstation. One technician frowned, his voice edged with irritation. "We have a retrieval order from Chief Justice Graves." Marcus set his bag on the table and spoke slowly, sharply enough to cut off any protest. "And I have a duty to preserve evidence. Let me access the data." He did not wait for consent. He plugged his backup device into the auxiliary port. A green indicator began blinking, the progress bar crawling forward like a second hand, counting out life and death. "You're signing your own removal from this courthouse," one technician whispered. Marcus replied without turning around. "If I don't do this, I'm signing away my own integrity." The device signaled completion. At the exact moment a hand reached toward his shoulder. Marcus unplugged it, slipped it into his bag, and locked it shut. "Done. Continue your work." He walked out before they could stop him. In the hallway, a guard watched him pass, eyes uncertain. As Marcus went by, the man murmured, "You should be careful, Hale. Crossing graves means you don't come back." Marcus paused for half a second and answered simply, "I don't choose sides. I choose the law." Then he continued without looking back. Helena stood near the end of the corridor, amid the thinning crowd. When Marcus appeared, their eyes met for a brief moment. She asked nothing, and he said nothing more. But from that short nod, Helena understood that Marcus had just saved the entire case from being swallowed by the dark. In a corner of the hallway, Rosa pretended to check her phone, yet her eyes stayed on Helena, gauging the situation. Carl maintained the posture of a middle-aged man exhausted by a long morning, but his finger tapped lightly against the edge of a stone bench, producing a soft knock to signal that everything was still under control. Vikram stood a bit farther away, blended into the crowd. But Helena needed only a glance to recognize his solid, familiar build. She did not signal back. At this moment, everything was too dangerous for any connection to be revealed. A courthouse employee hurried over, breath broken from rushing. "Judge Crane is calling an internal session immediately." He glanced around, then lowered his voice. "They want to hold all witnesses, including you." Helena understood at once what that meant. This was not a summons to clarify, but to contain. If these witnesses were confined inside, their statements could be twisted, steered, or erased. She kept her tone steady. "Where do they want to hold us?" "Inspection Room 2, behind the administrative wing," the employee replied, unable to hide his anxiety. Marcus stepped in. "They don't have the right to detain observers without written cause." He looked at Helena, waiting to see if she would act immediately. Helena thought fast. She knew that resisting outright would expose her true identity. But if this group was led into an internal room, any objective testimony could be reshaped within minutes. The situation offered no perfect choice. "Go," she said to Marcus in a low voice, meant only for him. "I need to see what they're planning." Marcus nodded and walked beside her, keeping just enough distance to avoid attention. As they moved toward Inspection Room 2, the hallway grew unnaturally quiet. Courthouse staff avoided their gaze as they passed, as if afraid that Helena's eyes might illuminate things they had chosen not to see. Elsewhere, Bradley was dragged down a different corridor. He continued cursing Helena, his voice breaking into fragments, half from pain, half from panic. Civilians pressed against the walls to make way. A woman whispered to her friend, "I've never seen anything like that. My God, they actually fought back." As they neared the inspection room, Helena saw the heavy steel door standing slightly ajar. Two officers waited outside, their faces neutral, but their hands rested on their belts in a defensive stance. One of them said, "Go in. All witnesses will have their statements collected under the new directive." The internal meeting room of the Eastbrook courthouse carried the smell of damp paper, stale coffee, and a suffocating atmosphere deliberately sealed in, the way people lock a basement that has not been opened for years. Yellow ceiling lights hung low over a long wooden table, revealing faces growing paler with every breath. The door was locked. The windows were shut. The four walls seemed to draw inward, forcing those inside to expose their true nature. Crane stood at the head of the table, both hands pressed against the wood, veins bulging like ropes. He stared at the stack of files before him, though his eyes were not truly reading anything. He spoke slowly, his voice straining to maintain a calm he no longer believed in. The official report will state that the defendant became agitated. The observers caused a disturbance. The situation spiraled out of control due to their chaos. Attested the $. He emphasized the word "they," as if severing himself from any responsibility. Halford stood to Crane's right, arms crossed over his chest, forcing himself to look composed. Yet every movement betrayed a slight tremor in his shoulders. Under the dim lights, that tremor looked like an animal exposed at its weakest point. Halford spoke, his voice hoarse with strain. "And the camera? What that woman said? That Crane cut him off. No one mentions it in the record. Not a single word. Too mucher." The room fell silent for a moment before Bradley shattered it with a rasping sound. He leaned back in his chair, his face pulled sharply to one side from Helena's punch. His left eye was swollen shut, his lip split, and his jaw hurt so badly that every word sounded like gravel grinding together. "Let me talk," he hissed. "She hit me for no reason. Those people will believe me over some poor black woman." The words landed in the room like a stone smashing the surface of a lake. Halford grimaced and turned away, his breath catching. It was not outrage at Bradley's insult toward Helena, but the sheer stupidity of it, making everything harder to conceal. Crane slammed his hand on the table, the bang echoing through the room and making both officers flinch. "Shut up!" he barked. "Do you think this entire courthouse survives on reckless words like that? Do you think graves will shield you just because you know how to flatter?" Bradley ground his teeth, but said nothing more. He lowered his head, yet the rage in his eyes still burned, fueled by pain and the realization that he had gone too far and could not find his way back. A brief, uneasy quiet settled over the room. Halford's gaze drifted away from Crane and landed on the door, as if he wished it would open and let him escape. His chest felt heavy as stone. Helena's eyes at the gate earlier that morning replayed in his mind. Not the eyes of an ordinary citizen, not the eyes of someone afraid. They were the eyes of someone who had stood at the edge between life and death many times, someone who did not flinch before violence. He knew he had chosen the wrong target. Bradley rose unsteadily, bracing one hand against the table to keep his balance. "As long as we hide in cell 6, we'll be fine." He said it in a weak, low voice, yet every word fell into the room like a slab of ice. The phrase froze the air instantly, no one daring to breathe more than necessary. Cell 6. Halford bowed his head as if he had just heard the name of a demon. Crane looked at Bradley, and something flashed in his eyes that was more than anger. It was fear. The kind of fear that powerful men hide carefully beneath layers of office and authority. Halford spoke slowly, his words uneven. "If they uncover that, even graves won't be able to save us." No one replied. But that silence carried more weight than any answer. All of them understood. If holding cell 6 were exposed, the entire system they relied on would collapse like concrete eaten away from the inside. Crane swept the files aside and dropped into his chair with a loss of control very few had ever witnessed. He pressed a hand to his forehead and spoke so quietly that even Bradley had to hold his breath to hear. I told you how many times? Everything about Cell 6 was supposed to disappear. I wanted it erased from history. And yet, you let Reyes's mouth stay alive until today. Bradley swallowed, his throat feeling sliced raw. I thought. He knew better. Crane let out a laugh that choked in his throat. Knew better? You cornered a man, and he snapped back. You thought desperate people would stay obedient? Halford licked his lips, his collar damp with sweat. If they reopen investigations into the whole courtroom, there will be traces. People who went through Cell 6. He hesitated because continuing meant admitting something he wanted buried as deeply as possible. We can't hide it. Crane did not look at him. That depends on who investigates. The words dropped the temperature in the room by another degree. As the two officers struggled to cling to Crane's statements like lifelines, a soft knock sounded at the door. Just one knock, but all three men spun around. The door cracked open, and a young security staffer slipped inside, his face drained of color. He lowered his voice as if the walls themselves might be listening. Chief Justice Graves wants an immediate situation report. He says, everything must be erased before tonight. The final words locked everyone in place. Bradley looked at Crane, panic flooding his face. Erase? What? The security staffer swallowed hard, his eyes flicking between them before he answered slowly. Everything connected to holding Cell 6. Crane closed his eyes for a single second, his eyelids twitching as if he had just heard a death sentence. Halford stepped back, bumping into the wall without noticing. Bradley's hands began to shake, and the chair behind him toppled to the floor with a sharp, jarring crash. In that moment, Helena was 4 walls away. Hearing none of this, yet every decision about to be made inside this room would redirect the entire storm she had just set in motion. Night descended over the state Supreme Court like a thick blanket draped across a machine of power, long accustomed to darkness more than light. In the spacious office paneled with deep brown wood, Milton Graves sat behind a large desk buried under documents, his hand slowly turning a silver fountain pen that had accompanied him through 3 decades of his career. The pale yellow desk lamp cast its glow onto 3 neatly stacked folders placed before him, each labeled confidential. Every word like a barbed hook lodged in his conscience for years. On the first folder was a single line, holding Cell 6. He opened the folder very slowly, as if what lay inside carried the stale scent of a secret left to rot. The first page was a black and white photograph of a black man lying on a concrete floor, eyes wide open yet hollow, lips tinged purple. Beneath it was written, Cause of Death. Medical complication. Graves looked at the line and released a faint sigh, his breath mixing with the air and chilling the room another degree. He knew the man in the photograph had not died from a medical complication. He knew that, more clearly than anyone. A soft knock sounded at the door. His assistant, Evan Moore, stepped in with an unreadable expression, a stack of evening newspapers in his hands. Sir, the press has heard about what happened at Eastbrook. It's only a leak for now, but if they dig deeper. Graves looked up, his eyes sharpening like a freshly honed blade. We will rewrite everything, he replied, in an even, unwavering voice. Moore hesitated, then nodded, accustomed to that cold style of command. Graves pulled another report toward him, one he had rewritten in less than half an hour after news of the chaos in Courtroom 3 reached him. He read each line as if rehearsing testimony for a staged performance. The defendant resisted. Observers caused disruption. The officer acted in self-defense. He repeated it 3 times, ensuring that by morning every mouth within the system would speak the same language. Moore placed a long list on the desk, 2 full pages of names belonging to officers, judges, and technicians who had at one time received favors or envelopes from Graves. All of them can be reached tonight, Moore said. Graves turned the pages, his eyes skimming each name, as if measuring their usefulness. Call them all, he said. Anyone who owes me, this is when they pay. Outside the window, the streets of New York glowed with endless lines of headlights, but from Graves's vantage point, the city looked like a vast chessboard, every person a piece moving at his command. He stood and walked to the glass, hands clasped behind his back. Erase all temporary records. Tomorrow morning's court session must look as if nothing ever happened, he said without turning around. Moore asked quietly, And the camera in courtroom 3, sir? Graves waved a hand. The retrieval order is already out. By morning, there will be nothing left. Moore hesitated briefly before asking his final question. And state legislator Helena Cole? Her name made Graves stop mid-step. He turned, his eyes darkening noticeably. She must not leave a footprint at Eastbrook, he said, his voice so low that Moore understood it was not a threat. Cole has too many eyes on her. If she leads an investigation, it won't just be us facing trouble. Graves returned to his desk and opened the second folder. Inside was an old transcript from an internal investigation he himself had once shut down. The ink had faded with time, but the content still carried lethal weight. Suspected abuse in temporary detention. The camera stopped functioning at 2:14 in the morning. Recommendation for further investigation. He tore the report from the folder, crushed it into a ball, and tossed it into the trash. No one is to reopen this, he said, as if speaking to himself. Moore noticed Graves's hand trembling slightly. This was not the tremor of age, but of a man pushed to the edge of a long-buried secret. Sir, Moore said, should we inform the security director about Cell 6? Graves turned sharply, his gaze cutting like a knife. No, only we know. The more people who know, the harder it is to control. He sat back down, ran both hands through his hair, then said abruptly, That day, I should never have let it be written off as a medical complication. Moore lowered his eyes, not daring to respond. He knew well that the nightmare of Cell 6 had haunted Graves for many nights, because Moore himself had drafted the altered report in that year. The phone on Graves's desk vibrated with a new message. He touched the screen with a fingertip, his eyes narrowing as he read the words that appeared. The message had no sender, no number, just one sentence, but it made Graves straighten as if struck at the base of the skull. We know about holding Cell 6, and we will reach it before you. Moore stepped closer, alarmed. Who sent that? Graves stared at the screen for several seconds, as if dissecting every word, then slowly set the phone down. Not the press, he said quietly. Not internal. This phrasing. It doesn't match anyone in the system. He turned back to the desk, looking down at the 6 files spread before him. And they're not the kind who can be bought. He closed his eyes, then opened them, his gaze turning razor cold. Moore, prepare midnight subpoenas. We must gather every document related to Cell 6 before dawn. Leave not a single ink mark behind. Moore nodded and hurried out to carry out the order. Graves stood, gazing through the glass at the night sky beyond the city. Below him, the city still roared, but he could feel with absolute clarity the silence waiting behind those sounds. A silence that signaled the beginning of a new hunt. The medical room of the Eastbrook courthouse sat at the end of the ground-floor corridor, smaller than one might expect, heavy with the sharp smell of disinfectant, and washed in white light that made everything feel cold and exposed. Jonathan Reyes lay on a metal bed, a thin blanket drawn over him, barely masking the tremor rising and falling in his chest. The on-duty doctor adjusted his glasses on the bridge of his nose and spoke quietly to Helena as she stepped inside. He hasn't slept for 3 nights. His body is exhausted from fear. The doctor shook his head, lowering his voice further. I've seen a few people come out of holding Cell 6. They all have the same look in their eyes. Reyes opened his eyes at the sound of footsteps, his bloodshot gaze darting with the panic of an animal driven to the edge. "Are they taking me back?" he asked, his voice hoarse as if squeezed by unseen hands. Helena pulled a chair closer and sat, keeping a respectful distance. "You're safe. At least for now," she said, her tone low and steady. "What you need to do is tell the truth. The rest is for Prosecutor Hale and me to handle." Reyes swallowed hard, his hand trembling uncontrollably atop the blanket. "3 days ago, they locked me in cell 6, he whispered, his eyes fixed on space, as if the scene were still unfolding before him. It was freezing, dark like the bottom of a well, and there were no cameras. Each word scraped across Helena like a layer of ice. In her mind, cell 6 formed as a chamber, deliberately cut off from all light, a place designed not to detain, but to erase. Reyes closed his eyes for a few seconds to gather breath. "I heard someone moaning in the corner, very faint, like someone trying to hold on to their last breath," he continued. "Then it stopped, so completely I thought I'd gone deaf." Helena recorded every sentence in an even voice, though her chest tightened. Silence, sometimes, was far more terrifying than screams. He opened his eyes again, his voice breaking. "An officer told me, 'Keep your head down if you don't want to follow the second guy.'" Reyes struggled to breathe, his lungs feeling crushed. I thought I was going to die in there. I tried to sleep, but I kept hearing footsteps. Every moment I thought they were coming back in. It's dead." Helena felt his body tense as the memory took hold, his hands clawing at the edge of the blanket as if he might tear it apart just to release the fear. "When they pulled me out, they said the camera was broken. They told me I'd better know my place." Reyes let out a hollow laugh, as if he had never imagined he would live to say such words. "But today, I couldn't take it anymore. I knew if I stayed quiet, tonight, they would take me back there." "Isertus?" Helena drew a slow breath, keeping her voice calm. "You did the right thing. What you said is the key to unlocking the truth." Her eyes moved to the bruises along Reyes's neck, the marks of someone's hands, their color confirming his story as part of a systematic chain of violence. "I promise you, this will not be buried in silence." Reyes blinked, then looked straight at her, his gaze wet yet strangely clear. "If you hadn't stood up today, I really would have died. I know they would have done it." Gratitude and terror mixed in his voice, pressing a different kind of weight against Helena's chest. Not political pressure, but responsibility for a life that had just slipped free from death's grip. The medical room fell quiet for a moment, broken only by the steady blinking of the heart monitor. White light washed over Reyes's pallid face, highlighting the taut veins in his neck like traces of a struggle between life and death. Helena dipped her head to record the final part of his statement, but before her pen touched paper, the doors swung open. Marcus Hale stepped inside, his face drawn tight like a string pulled beyond its limit. Dust from the hallway clung to his jacket. His tie was crooked, yet his eyes were sharper and more alert than ever. He closed the door and moved closer, speaking very softly but urgently. "We have a problem." Helena stood at once, unease running up her spine. "What is it?" Marcus showed her the backed-up footage, the screen displaying the final seconds of Bradley grabbing Helena by the collar. "Graves has sent people to look for you. Not to summon you. To find you." He emphasized the last word, enough to make Reyes flinch reflexively. "They're moving floor by floor. I saw 2 from the security team asking about you." Helena set her jaw, her gaze turning cold. "What does Graves want?" Marcus shook his head. "I don't know, but I recognize the signs when a system decides to swallow someone before the story gets out. And right now, he sees you as the biggest threat." He glanced at Reyes, then back at Helena. "We both know this. If they get to you now, Everything about Cell 6 will vanish before dawn. Reyes pushed himself halfway upright. Despite being so weak, he swayed. Don't go. You can't let them take you in there, he whispered, his voice splitting like a rope stretched to its limit. Helena turned back and placed a hand on his shoulder to steady him. No one is taking me anywhere. Marcus looked toward the hallway, where the sound of security boots echoed closer, each step like a countdown. We have to leave now, he said. I know a side exit that leads to the ambulance bay. No cameras. No guards. Helena folded the documents and slipped them inside her jacket. Every fragment of truth Reyes had just shared, every tremor in his body, every fear tied to Cell 6, all of it fueled something boiling in her chest. Go, she said. Reyes caught her sleeve for a final second, his voice shaking but clear. Please, don't let me be the only one who survives and isn't believed, Helena answered with her eyes, an expression heavier than any promise. Then she turned to Marcus and gave a slight nod. The private interview room sat isolated at the far end of the second-floor corridor, where gray-painted walls and white fluorescent lights made the space feel colder than a holding cell. Samuel Ortiz sat in the middle of the room, both elbows resting on his knees, hands tightly interlocked as if trying to keep himself from breaking apart. His gaze was fixed on the tiled floor, where a long crack ran like a boundary line between silence and truth. A recording officer pulled out a chair and sat across from him, placing a small recorder on the metal table, cold and unforgiving. We'll begin, the officer said, his tone neutral to preserve procedure. Ortiz took a deep breath, the sound echoing like that of someone preparing to step out of darkness. Officer Bradley Kane struck the defendant first, he said, his voice low at the start but steady, and he threatened an observer as well. The recording officer looked up, caution flashing in his eyes. Are you certain? This statement will be sent directly to the state level. Ortiz raised his head, his eyes tired but unwavering. I have never been more certain than I am right now, he continued in a voice that was even yet sharp as a carving blade. The times Bradley slapped detainees in the holding area, the times he squeezed defendants' throats to intimidate them, the pleas that went silent after the cell door closed. Ortiz spoke without stopping, as if everything that had accumulated over 7 years was finally finding a way out through words. Holding Cell 6. He paused for a single second, then looked straight at the recorder. I had heard about it. Someone died. There were no cameras. No one dared ask. The recording officer kept writing, his face tightening when he heard the word died. Ortiz breathed hard, as though dragging each memory up from an abyss. I stayed silent for too long. I was afraid I'd be seen as an accomplice, but if I didn't speak today, I wouldn't be able to sleep. He swallowed, his throat constricting with the struggle between guilt and release. I let Bradley do it many times. I told myself I was just following orders, but that was a lie I used to forgive myself. When Helena was mentioned, Ortiz paused for half a beat, his expression softening. She dared to do what I was afraid of. She spoke up, and she defended herself. He shook his head slightly, as if trying to keep emotion from intruding, yet the words still came out, raw enough to make the recording officer look up. She was not wrong. News of Ortiz's statement spread beyond the room in less than 20 minutes. People in the hallway leaned together, whispering in waves. A few officers who had once been close to Bradley went pale, murmuring among themselves about who might be called next. Halford stood with his back against the wall, his jaw twitching like someone who had just glimpsed his own sentence. Sweat rolled down his temples, even though the corridor felt like a cold storage room. He could hear Ortiz's voice through the half-open door, and each word struck him like an open slap. Crane appeared a few minutes later, his face tightening with every step. When he saw the recording officer preparing to close the report, he said coldly, "Pause the session." I want to review the content before it's forwarded." But the inspector, standing beside the recorder, answered in a firmness rarely heard in Eastbrook Court. "No. This is a state-level investigation. You do not have the authority to intervene." Crane flinched, his lips parting as if to protest. But the inspector's gaze made it clear that this time, pressure would not work. Inside the room, Ortiz signed the statement. His signature was small and careful, yet steady, like a man decisively cutting the rope that had bound him for years. When he set the pen down, his shoulders trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the release of a long-held weight from his chest. He looked up at the recording officer and said slowly, "Send it straight to the state. I will not change my testimony." The officer nodded and gathered the recorder. "You understand that after today, you will be placed under temporary protection," he said. "But it also means you'll be standing in the center of the storm." Ortiz exhaled, a weary smile flickering across his face. "I've been standing in the center of the storm for years. It's just that before, I kept my head down." The news spread, touching every corner of Eastbrook Court. A female clerk whispered to a colleague, "If Ortiz dared to speak, then something big must be true." A young officer near the stairwell fidgeted so badly he that dropped his notebook. Another pulled him back and murmured, "Stay away from Bradley today. He's lost it." On the third floor, Halford paced back and forth like a man without direction. He lowered his voice, calling superiors who did not answer. When he spotted Crane passing by, he rushed over. "What do we do?" Graves said. Crane cut him off with a sharp gesture and dragged him into a shadowed corner. "Keep your mouth shut. Not one word. Open it now, and you dig your own grave," he said, his voice biting down on each syllable. In the dim light, Halford noticed a thin sheen of sweat on Crane's forehead, proof that the old judge was shaking more than he had imagined. Elsewhere in the courthouse, Ortiz was escorted to a temporary isolation room to wait for protective services to take him to a vehicle. He sat on a plastic chair, both hands cradling his head, his breathing rapid like someone who had just escaped a dark place and had not yet adjusted to the light. Beyond the glass door, several observers lingered in the hallway, looking at him with expressions mixing gratitude and disbelief. A woman whispered, "Someone finally dared to tell the truth." At last, someone did. Ortiz looked up at them through the glass, a fleeting second that felt like drawing his first real breath in years. He thought of Helena, of the punch she threw in self-defense, of Reyes's eyes when he said, "I would have died if you hadn't stood up." All of it merged into something that steadied him. When the security officer opened the door, Ortiz stepped out, no longer bowing his head. His legs still trembled, but his stride no longer avoided the world. For the first time, the walls of Eastbrook did not make him feel suffocated. In the hallway, Helena's phone vibrated. Marcus showed her a new message from the Judicial Oversight Office, the line short but heavy as a command. "All witnesses will be summoned, starting tomorrow. Be prepared. Eastbrook can no longer hide." Helena looked at the screen, then at Marcus. Her eyes were hard as steel, yet beneath them lay a quiet sorrow for people like Reyes, Ortiz, and so many others, swallowed by the dark pit called Eastbrook. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "everything starts to open." Marcus nodded, his own eyes brightening like someone ready to step into a battle with no retreat. Somewhere on the upper floors of the courthouse, hurried footsteps echoed again, a sign that the system was shaking from its foundation. The following morning, G draped Eastbrook in a pallid light, a symbol of long-hidden exhaustion finally exposed. From the very start of the corridor, the arrival of the internal inspection team caused the atmosphere to sag perceptibly. Officers who had been mid-conversation froze, while civilians waiting for hearings fell silent, as if an invisible signal had ordered them to keep their distance. Every gaze, whether a glance or a lifted stare, converged on the group wearing gleaming state badges, a kind of brightness Eastbrook rarely ever saw. In the break room, Bradley was bracing both elbows on the table, trying to steady himself in the mirror after a night of humiliation and pain. His jaw was still bruised purple, every swallow sending a jolt of ache through him. But what gnawed at him most was the thought that someone had dared spit on his authority right in the middle of the courtroom. The door burst open before he could curse, and two inspectors stepped in as if they already knew every shadow he had tried to hide. The one in front read the order in an even voice. "Officer Bradley Kane, you are being charged with assaulting a civilian and obstructing justice." Each word landed like a nail driven into concrete. For a split moment, Bradley could only stare, convinced he had misheard. Then he sprang up, his voice breaking into a raw snarl. "I didn't do anything! That woman set me up! Ortiz! Traitors!" His face flushed crimson, veins at his temples bulging as if about to burst. But before his protest could take shape, one inspector pivoted him around and wrenched his arms behind his back, the movement so practiced that Bradley never had a chance to resist. Out in the hallway, Ortiz stood with his back against the wall, hands clasped together. When Bradley was marched out, their eyes met in a silence heavy as lead. Bradley screamed, his voice hoarse with rage. "You're dead, Ortiz! You dare go against me?" Ortiz flinched, old instinct urging him to look away. But this time, he did not. Not because he was stronger, but because, for the first time, he was no longer afraid of the shadow of power Bradley had pressed onto his shoulders for so long. The sound of Bradley's struggling shoes echoed like that of a beast dragged from the jungle into open ground. A female inspector walked beside him, her eyes cold and steady. She spoke in a tone nearly devoid of emotion. "Now you know what it feels like to be abused by power." The words cut deeper into Bradley than Helena's punch the day before. He turned toward her, mouth opening to shout, but his lips trembled and closed again when he realized that no one in Eastbrook looked at him as frightening anymore. Civilians gathered along the corridor watched the scene with unfamiliar expressions. They did not cheer, nor did they jeer. Their looks resembled a long exhale, released after years of being held down. An elderly man standing by a courtroom door murmured, just loud enough for Helena to hear, "It's time someone paid." The young woman beside him placed a hand on her stomach, as if steadying herself. They were not exhilarated. They were tired, but threaded through that fatigue was a seed of hope. Helena stood at the far end of the corridor, neither stepping closer nor retreating. She watched Bradley being pushed toward the elevator, amid a ring of agents, as one might watch a buried root of the system being torn out. When the vehicle doors closed, she caught a fleeting glimpse of him still struggling in vain. His hands pounding against the glass, like a warped reflection of the power he had once believed untouchable. The moment brought her no satisfaction. Instead, it deepened her understanding of the bind that ensnared both oppressor and oppressed alike. Ortiz walked toward Helena, his steps heavy, as if he had just climbed a long slope he had feared for years. He was about to speak when an inspector stepped in first, handing Helena a slip of paper with the time of the hearing. "Next is Judge Harold Crane." The man's voice was low and clipped, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Then he lowered it further, a reminder and a warning at once. "And you should know, Graves is losing his composure. If..." The words settled into the air like sediment sinking to the bottom of a glass. Graves, the head of the system, the man who had never shown weakness before the public, if he was truly wavering, it meant that what Helena and the three legislators had done was no longer an isolated incident. It had reached the deeper tier, where decisions were made behind closed doors, where the death in Holding Cell 6 had been rewritten with ink so thick it obscured the soul of the dead. Helena looked down the long, hollow corridor, where courtroom doors stood ajar like the mouths of bottomless wells. She knew she was no longer a disguised observer. Her role had come fully into view for the sharpest eyes watching, and the truth she carried from courtroom 3 had become tinder, spreading through the entire system. A group from the Inspector General's office emerged from the elevator, lists of witnesses in hand. They called out names in firm voices. There would be no retreat for anyone entangled in this case. And in the cold draft sweeping through the hallway, Helena knew that the day Bradley was led away was only the beginning of a far greater storm. Courtroom 3 felt as empty as an abandoned church when Harold Crane stepped inside. Light from the tall windows fell across the judge's bench, where the wooden gavel lay alone, cold and lifeless. He looked at it as one looks at something that once belonged to him, but to which he no longer had the right to reach. When he placed his hand on the gavel, the familiar sensation was no longer one of control, but a numbness that shot straight up his wrist. Crane set it down again, slowly, as though laying to rest a part of his life so entwined with him that he had forgotten it was never truly his forever. The Judicial Discipline Committee stood in a line at the center of the courtroom, their expressions severe enough to make the air feel heavier. The chair of the panel opened a file and spoke in an even, unforgiving voice. "Judge Harold Crane, you are hereby suspended from your duties pending the conclusion of this investigation." The final words landed softly, yet they were enough to send a chill through Crane's spine. He swallowed, trying to draw breath, but his lungs seemed unwilling to obey. Crane spoke, but his voice came out weak and broken. "I was only following procedure. I knew nothing about holding cell 6. The defense fell to the courtroom floor like a wet scrap of paper, carrying no weight for anyone to grasp. The official standing closest to him looked at him with a calm that bordered on cruelty, the calm of people who had seen too many men blame circumstance for their own choices. Another committee member opened a second file and set it before him. "You received warnings regarding human rights violations 6 months ago. You ignored them. 3 reports concerning violent conduct by Officer Bradley Kane were dismissed by you as lacking sufficient grounds. And 2 petitions regarding malfunctioning cameras in the holding area were relegated to archival storage." Each sentence struck with the steady rhythm of a hammer, tightening Crane's chest. Sweat soaked into his collar. But what made him tremble was not the reports themselves. What terrified him was what Graves held over him. Crane remembered it clearly. The shadowy loan from the year 2013, resurfacing now like a dark stain. It had come when his wife needed money for medical treatment, and Graves had extended his hand like a savior. Only now did Crane fully understand the cost of that help, years spent serving as a shield for decay. When the session ended, Crane walked out of the courtroom with the heavy gait of a man stripped bare. The long corridor was unnaturally quiet, broken only by the sound of his shoes, each step like a dull knock against walls grown mossy with time. At the turn, he saw Helena Cole leaning against the railing. The look in her eyes held neither hatred nor pity. It was the gaze of someone seeing a man ensnared by the very choices he had clung to. Crane stopped, struggling to keep his voice from shaking. "I tried to survive in this system, and it swallowed me." The words rang out like a belated confession, not to Helena, but to himself after years of self-deception. His eyes dulled, not with tears, but with the exhaustion of someone who had finally realized he had strayed too far to turn back. Helena remained silent. She offered no answer, no judgment. That silence carried more meaning than any spoken response. Fear may be instinct, but using fear as justification to trample others is a choice. Crane lowered his head, as though that unspoken truth struck deeper than any accusation. As Crane was escorted toward the courthouse exit, people lined the corridor. Faces he had once dismissed as nuisances now regarded him with expressions carrying both contempt and a strange, sober sense of justice. Some whispered, others held back old anger. But all understood that this was not a moment for celebration. It was the moment when one of the first pillars of power collapsed. Crane avoided their eyes, lifting his feet higher to conceal his trembling. Yet every step felt as though he were carrying a weight of shame turned to stone. When he was pushed into the vehicle, he turned back one last time, staring down the corridor where he had ruled for years with the sound of a wooden gavel. Now it no longer resembled a throne, but an empty coffin waiting for the next secrets to be laid bare. At a distance, Marcus Hale was speaking quickly with an inspector when he noticed Helena approaching. Before she could ask anything, a courthouse employee rushed over, face pale with urgency. The man spoke in broken breaths. "Graves is calling an emergency hearing. It looks like he's trying to twist the entire case." His eyes were wide with confusion, as if he had just learned that a massive building was about to collapse. Marcus frowned and closed his file. If he's doing that, it means he's truly desperate. His voice dropped. Helena heard him and felt the air shift slightly, because someone like Graves never revealed loss of control unless something had reached the very roots of his power. A cold draft swept through the corridor, carrying the faint clatter of glass doors. Helena straightened and looked toward the old courtroom 3, where everything had begun. She knew Graves would not stand idle while the network he had painstakingly built was shaken. He would strike back, and when he did, the blow would be precise, violent, and leave no path of retreat for anyone. The following morning, Eastbrook awoke to a shockwave no one had been prepared for. Early news broadcasts simultaneously replayed leaked footage from Courtroom 3. Only a few brief seconds, but enough to drill straight into the hearts of viewers. Reyes's scream, the sound of a chair toppling, Bradley's silhouette lunging forward, and the distorted threats filtered through static became tinder for an anger that spread like wildfire. No one needed to see the whole truth. That much alone was enough to make the entire state ask a single question. Why had a courthouse turned into a battlefield? A local radio station opened an unusual live program, taking non-stop calls from residents of Eastbrook. An older woman's voice came through the line, trembling yet resolute. "We were afraid to speak. We've been afraid for years. But today, someone spoke for us." Her words traveled farther than radio waves, echoed across social media like a plea suppressed for far too long. Helena heard the line while watching television in her room, and she felt the weight of every word like an invisible hand pulling her back toward her true responsibility. Online, the hashtags number Eastbrook Justice and number Investigate Courtroom 3 exploded within hours. People shared their own experiences. Poor defendants being crushed, documents seized without cause, police abuse in the corridors, stories once dismissed as rumor, now forming a collective testimony. Under that pressure, civil rights organizations stepped in, article after article, calling for a full investigation, spreading so widely that major political offices were forced to pay attention. Something cracked within society itself. Silence. By midday, the media descended on Eastbrook in numbers like a festival. Though the mood was somber rather than celebratory, cameras occupied every step leading to the courthouse entrance, reporters crowding one another to capture the new center of attention in the case. Halford passed by with his cap pulled low, trying to hide behind a newspaper. But a reporter still recognized him. A voice called out, "Do you have any comment on the Courtroom 3 footage?" Halford pressed himself against the wall and hurried away like a man fleeing, his face pale as though his last layer of armor had been stripped away. Marcus Hale appeared at the courthouse entrance and was immediately surrounded by dozens of microphones. He maintained a calm stance, shoulders squared like a shield between the crowd and the vulnerable. "No one is above the law," he said briefly, his voice slightly hoarse from lack of sleep but steady. "No police officer has the right to strike someone inside a courtroom. This is not a holding pen." The statement was concise, sharp, and strong enough to be replayed across every evening broadcast. A reporter then turned toward Helena, who was still listed under an alias among the observers. "You were in the courtroom. How did it feel to witness that scene?" Helena looked straight into the lens, without flinching. "I saw fear," she answered slowly, "and I saw why people are afraid. It was not a call to action, nor a verdict spoken for others, but it was enough for listeners to understand that the truth did not lie in violence, but in the fear that violence created." By afternoon, the governor's office was flooded with hundreds of calls from constituents. Oversight groups demanded a state-level investigation. Even a federal lawmaker spoke on television, saying that what happened in Eastbrook was a sign of a rotting system that needs to be brought into the light. It no longer felt as though Eastbrook was a local courthouse, but rather an arrow driven straight into the political heart of the entire state. Inside the building, Halford stared from a second-floor window at the chaotic mass of reporters, police vehicles, civilians, and protest signs below. His eyes trembled in a rare moment of vulnerability. "If they dig deeper, I'm finished," he muttered, his lips drying as if he had swallowed ash. Each breath grew sharper, as he thought of holding Cell 6, of the threats he had issued so casually, out of habit. Now every word, once tossed lightly like a feather, was becoming evidence heavy as stone. Helena left the courthouse as dusk fell. Lines of news vehicles were still parked outside, camera lights flickering across the pavement like a strip of metal vibrating under tension. She walked quickly, avoiding recognition, because her true identity still had to remain hidden until everything was in the right place. Yet, the sensation of being watched clung to her back like a shadow that refused to let go. The street leading home was darker than usual, the wind strong, stirring scraps of paper into brief spirals. Helena unlocked the door and stepped into the quiet. The small Brooklyn apartment looked exactly as it had when she left it. Tidy, but bare, like a place meant only for someone who returned from nameless missions carried out in the dark. She turned on the light, set her bag down, then stood by the door for a few seconds, checking for any sign of forced entry. Everything was still. But as she bent down to pick up the evening newspaper at her door, her eyes caught something that made her heart stutter. A white envelope lay in the center of the doormat, thin and unsealed. No sender's name, no postmark, no symbol, just a single slanted line of handwriting, hurried yet clear. "They are watching holding Cell 6. Do not go alone." Helena stood motionless for several seconds. Outside, the sound of distant sirens faded, while inside the room there was only the wind tapping lightly against the window. She opened the envelope slowly, without haste or trembling, with the caution of someone who had survived unnamed battlefields. Inside, there was no letter, no photograph. Only a tiny memory card, no larger than a fingertip. Her heartbeat slowed. Helena held the card under the yellow light, as if it were a key to the remaining portion of the truth Graves was trying to extinguish. A piece of truth heavy enough to make anyone involved pay a price. She placed the card on the table, sat down, and released a long, steady breath. Questions lined up in her mind. Who had sent the envelope? How they knew where she lived? And most of all, which side they stood on in this war? Helena's temporary apartment was submerged in soft yellow light, spilling across the table where the white envelope had just been opened. A stack of papers slid out and scattered gently across the wooden surface. A death report. Several blurred photographs stamped with dates. Internal memos, with lines crudely blacked out. Helena's eyes moved across each page, as if rereading the story of a soul buried alive. Every word, every image shared one detail in common. Holding Cell 6. It felt as though she were opening the door to a room steeped in rot, where the truth had been forced down to the bottom of a well. On one sheet, a short annotation made her pause. Male victim, approximately 50 years old, Natural cardiac arrest. Beside, it was an autopsy photograph showing dark bruising running along the neck, a clear circular hand mark as if someone had wanted it to remain visible. Helena frowned, the tendons in her hand standing out as she held the page up. Caution had always been her instinct, but now it had shifted into the sensation of being pulled into a deep pit someone had tried to cover with a thin cloth. A knock sounded at the door, very light, as if whoever stood outside were testing the pressure before deciding to knock again. Helena stood up, not moving to the door immediately, but checking through the peephole. Outside was the older woman who had sat in the last row of the courtroom that day. She wore simple but neat clothing, her posture steady, her hands clasped together with an unreadable calm. Her eyes were sharp, as though they could see straight through the door. Helena opened it. The woman stepped inside without urgency, without glancing around for a seat. She merely gave a slight nod and spoke in a low voice. "I sat in the last row that day. It was not by chance." The words drifted into the room, light but rippling like a stone dropped into still water. Helena gestured for her to sit, while she herself remained standing, maintaining a safe distance. "Who are you?" Helena asked, angling herself so the light fell across the woman's face. The woman neither hid nor hurried her answer. Instead, she set a cloth bag on the table and gently slid it toward Helena. "Evelyn Marsh," she said, slowly and clearly. "I've been watching Eastbrook for a long time, longer than most people would guess." Helena looked at the bag, not opening it yet, pausing to assess the woman in front of her. Evelyn's gaze did not waver, but there was something in it, resembling the eyes of someone who had witnessed far worse than a chaotic courtroom. "You work for the press?" Helena asked, a familiar probing rhythm. Evelyn smiled faintly, the tilt of it carrying both sadness and quiet satisfaction at the question. "No," she said, "and I'm not with any human rights organization either." She brushed her hand across the table, drawing one of the autopsy photographs closer. "I work for justice. The kind of justice most people are afraid to look straight at." Helena did not answer immediately. A chill lingered at the back of her neck as she remembered holding cell 6, remembered Reyes's eyes when he said, "I know what they do in there." Evelyn looked at the stack of documents and continued, "I've tracked the people transferred into holding cell 6 for 8 months. Some came out with bodies covered in bruises. Others—" she paused, choosing her words carefully. "Others never came out at all." Helena drew a breath, then slowly opened the cloth bag. Inside was an old voice recorder, note papers marked with scattered symbols, and a handwritten list of names. Beside each name was a small red circle. "These people went into holding cell 6? Helena asked. Evelyn nodded. "And only 2 survived long enough to say anything. Reyes is one of them." "It's say." Evelyn sat down, her shoulders leaning slightly forward, like someone carrying bad news from a place no one dared approach. "I was waiting for someone strong enough to stand up," she said. "Not because they wanted attention, but because they understood the price of staying silent." Her eyes rested on Helena, not with admiration, but with recognition. This woman, with her punch in the courtroom, had triggered a force that Evelyn had been waiting for a long time. Helena picked up the falsified death report and flipped through the pages stamped with the courthouse's pale blue seal. The language read like a programmed template. Sudden cardiac arrest. No signs of external force. Victim had prior conditions. Every line contradicted the forensic images Evelyn had brought. Bruising, fractured nasal cartilage, scratches on the neck, evidence of a struggle in the dark. "Graves signed these?" Helena asked, her voice held tight. "No," Evelyn replied, "but he allowed them to exist." She pulled out an old newspaper clipping and laid it on the table. The article announced Graves's reappointment, accompanied by his stern statement about fighting crime. He built his image on maintaining order. Who gets saved? Who gets erased? He decides. Outside the window, distant sirens echoed. Helena felt the small apartment contract, the space between herself and the files narrowing. If Graves falls, Evelyn continued, he won't fall alone. A chain of people in the shadows will fall with him, and they know it. She looked at Helena with piercing clarity. That's why Holding Cell 6 exists. Not to punish criminals, but to protect those in power. Helena closed the folder and rested her hand on the edge of the envelope, as if trying to extinguish the fire building inside her. She knew from the moment she stepped into Eastbrook that this had gone far beyond a single trial. But only now, looking into Evelyn's eyes, did she grasp the true scale of the fight. A network burrowed deep, built on fear, power, and nameless deaths. Evelyn stood, adjusting the strap of the cloth bag on her shoulder. I didn't come to frighten you, she said, her voice softer. I came to confirm that you touched the right wire. And once you touched it, they were forced to show their faces. Helena stepped forward and held the door for her. Outside, night draped itself like a heavy black coat. The old yellow streetlights stretching Evelyn's shadow across the pavement like a silent question mark. She paused at the threshold and turned back one last time. If you want to go further, Evelyn said, lowering her voice to almost a whisper, there are people who want to meet you. Helena narrowed her eyes, half sensing what was coming, half feeling another door crack open. Evelyn tilted her head and spoke each word clearly. They call it Project Rise. She turned and walked away. Her frame small, but her steps steady, like someone long accustomed to dark paths. Helena stood still, watching until Evelyn's figure dissolved into the Brooklyn night. Behind her, inside the apartment, the Holding Cell 6 files lay open on the table like a living thing waiting to be named. And Evelyn's words echoed in her mind, slow and steady, like the beat of a distant drum. Night fell over Brooklyn like a heavy curtain, swallowing the city's sounds into its depths. Helena returned to her old office, where darkness and a thin layer of dust on the desk made it feel as though she were stepping into someone else's memory. Streetlights spilled through the window, illuminating familiar objects. The work notebook, the chair that bore the imprint of countless sleepless nights, the faded old district map pinned to the wall. Everything remained exactly where it had been when she left, yet she knew she now stood on an entirely different front line. She set her bag down on the desk and opened the envelope Evelyn had left behind. The first pages were maps of money flows, red arrows tracing paths from Eastbrook to Graves's office. Then, branching out to obscure legal consulting firms not registered to receive state funding. Helena's eyes stopped on a bold, circled note. Unaccounted expenditure, 410,000 United States dollars. The handwritten line felt like the ragged breathing of whoever had uncovered it, revealing the urgency of the information. The structure of power suddenly came into focus, sharp and distorted, like a cracked mirror. A small object no bigger than a fingertip slipped from the stack of papers. A black USB drive, unlabeled, accompanied by a folded note. View only when you are alone. Helena brushed her fingers against the device, a chill running through her fingertips. She sat down, powered on the computer, and inserted the USB into the port. The screen went dark for several seconds before a long list of names appeared. The first line made her tilt her head. Inmate list, Cell 6. Scrolling down, Helena saw names that did not appear in any official records she had ever reviewed. Beside each name was an intake date, the reason for detention written simply as pending verification. But when she reached the release dates, 3 of them were blank, marked only by thin gray dashes. She shuddered. These people had no release papers, no transfer records, no medical reports. They vanished from the system as if they had never existed. She leaned back in her chair, hands clasped together, staring at the screen. Part of her wondered how many people had died quietly like this, under the protection of a system that claimed to defend justice. In the office's darkness, Helena felt something shift inside her. Not mere outrage at abuse of power, but a heavy resolve, like the pressure of a storm just before it breaks. The phone rang, cutting through the silence. An unfamiliar number appeared. No area code. Helena hesitated for a few seconds, then answered. On the other end was a woman's voice, low and composed, so controlled that the space around Helena seemed to tighten. Congresswoman Cole, the voice said, we have been watching you since that day, since you walked into courtroom 3, since the moment you stood up. Helena did not reply immediately. She looked toward the window, where the city lights reflected like veins in the body of something enormous. The voice continued, lower still. But this is not the end. It is the opening. Helena braced one hand on the desk, feeling the words in the envelope pressing toward her, forming an invisible weight. Are you ready for the real fight? The question landed softly, yet sharp as a needle. Helena closed her eyes for a second, picturing Reyes's face as he clung to his last shred of trust. Picturing Ortiz standing before a choice of survival, picturing those buried behind the door of cell 6, whose names no one knew. She opened her eyes and answered, her voice slow but firm, like the footsteps of the military police she once was. I am ready, if it serves the innocent. There was a brief silence on the line. Then the voice replied, then, welcome to Project Rise. Helena felt as though the words did not come from a single person, but from an unseen force observing her, demanding she take one more step. The call disconnected, leaving behind a thin echo, like a wave rebounding in the room. She turned back to the screen, where the data file remained open. But now, a new window appeared, one not belonging to the USB. Not to any standard computer system. Just a single line of white text on a black background. Target 01. Milton Graves. Helena leaned closer, half doubting her own eyes. A file began downloading automatically. She opened it. Inside were Graves's asset declarations, decrypted private emails, and notes detailing the individuals who met with him after hearings marked by irregularities. Night wind slipped through the crack in the window, brushing the papers on the desk so that a few pages trembled, as if trying to warn her. Helena stood and walked to the window, looking down at the city. Traffic still flowed. Strangers still lived their ordinary lives, unaware that at this very moment, a power network stood on the edge of collapse. She felt with clarity that from the moment she picked up the USB, she had become an indispensable part of a new justice machine, one that offered no retreat. The next morning, Helena walked along the office hallway that had witnessed countless heated meetings and political negotiations. Today, each step felt quieter, heavier. She rested her hand on the door to her office for a long moment before pushing it open. Inside, the furniture remained unchanged, but now, it felt like the set of a stage where she had just finished playing an old role. She knew she would no longer participate familiarly. She took a blank sheet of paper and placed it at the center of the desk, then laid the holding cell 6 file on top of it. Like a silent oath, she placed her right hand on the first page. In that moment, Helena understood that Project Rise had not chosen her for the punch, nor for the title of Congresswoman, but for what made her stand up that day, the instinct to protect the vulnerable. The room fell silent. Then the computer screen lit up again, the text clear and unmistakable. Welcome, Helena Cole. Authorization pending. Below it, a countdown timer began to run. She stood watching it, unblinking. One chapter had ended. Another had begun.